How much of Canada's car industry has actually disappeared since this trade war began? In one sentence, nearly half, because Canadian vehicle production has collapsed from 2.3 million cars a year down to just 1.2 million. And the tariff sitting behind that collapse is still fully in place right now. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how an industry supporting more than 500,000 Canadian jobs got cut down this fast, and whether anything happening right now can actually reverse it. Let's start with the number that should stop you cold, because it is not a projection, it is what has already happened. Back in 2016, Canadian auto plants produced roughly 2.3 million vehicles in a single year. By last year, that number had fallen to just 1.2 million. That is not a gradual decline you might expect from shifting consumer preferences or a maturing industry. That is production being cut nearly in half within less than a decade, with the sharpest part of that drop happening specifically after tariffs reshaped the entire cross-border relationship this industry depended on. To put that decline in historical context, Canada's auto industry did not simply grow by accident over the previous half-century. It was deliberately built through one of the most successful trade arrangements in North American history, an agreement from the 1960s that allowed vehicles and parts to flow across the border largely without tariffs, in exchange for guaranteed minimum production commitments inside Canada. That arrangement transformed Canada into a genuine manufacturing powerhouse, attracting enormous investment and creating exactly the kind of deeply integrated cross-border supply chain that made both countries more competitive together than either could have managed alone. Watching that decades-old foundation erode this quickly is not just a bad quarter for one industry. It is the unwinding of a deliberate economic strategy that took 2 generations to build. Here is how this specific tariff actually works, because the mechanics matter for understanding why it hit so hard. Roughly a year and a half ago, Washington imposed a 25% tariff, not on the full value of Canadian-made vehicles, but specifically on the portion of each vehicle's content that did not originate in the United States. Because Canadian-assembled vehicles typically contain somewhere around 50% American-made parts already, given how deeply integrated this industry has been across the border for decades, the effective tariff rate on a typical Canadian-built car ends up landing around 12.5%. That might sound more manageable than a straight 25% tariff, but for an industry operating on notoriously thin margins, where a single percentage point can determine whether a plant stays profitable or gets shut down, even that reduced effective rate has proven devastating. This particular tariff structure also reveals something important about how deeply intertwined the two countries' auto industries actually are, in a way that makes the entire dispute almost self-defeating for both sides. Because so much of a Canadian-built car's value originates in the United States to begin with. Engines, transmissions, electronics, and countless other components, crossing the border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly process. A tariff aimed at punishing Canadian manufacturing inevitably ends up taxing American-made parts too, every time they cross back into the United States, embedded inside a finished Canadian-assembled vehicle. This is not a simple case of one country's industry losing at the expense of the other's clean victory. It is closer to both countries' auto industries getting tangled in the same tariff. Since the supply chain itself does not respect the border the tariff was designed to enforce, Canada did not simply absorb this quietly either. Ottawa responded with its own 25% tariff on American passenger vehicles and certain trucks, deliberately mirroring the same rules Washington had applied, essentially matching fire with fire rather than accepting the new terms without pushing back. The result has been a genuine trade war within a trade war, one specific to the auto sector, layered on top of everything else happening across steel, aluminum, energy, and agriculture, creating a genuinely complicated web of overlapping disputes that even trade experts struggle to fully untangle when trying to explain the current state of this relationship to the public. The consumer impact on both sides of the border has been immediate and measurable. Americans bought 132,000 fewer Canadian-made cars last year compared to before these tariffs took hold. Canadians, responding to their own government's retaliatory tariff, bought 62,000 fewer American-made vehicles over the same period. Multiply those numbers by the average price of a new vehicle, and you start to understand just how much economic activity simply stopped happening because of decisions made in trade negotiations that most car buyers never followed closely enough to connect to their own purchasing decisions. Here is what makes this particular industry different from steel or aluminum or any other single commodity we have covered on this channel, and why the stakes here are genuinely larger. Canada's auto industry contributed $17 billion to the country's economy in a recent year, and it does not stop at the assembly plants themselves. The industry directly employs more than 125,000 Canadians, but that number only tells part of the story. Because of how deeply auto manufacturing weaves into parts suppliers, logistics companies, dealerships, and countless smaller businesses that exist specifically to serve this industry, the indirect employment tied to Canadian auto manufacturing reaches an additional 427,000 jobs. Put those numbers together, and you are looking at more than 500,000 Canadian livelihoods connected in some way to an industry that has just watched its production capacity nearly cut in half. Think about what a number that large actually means when it starts shrinking rather than growing. An assembly plant losing production does not just affect the workers directly on that factory floor, it ripples outward to the steel supplier providing raw material, the seat manufacturer down the road, the trucking company moving parts between facilities, the diner where shift workers grab lunch, and eventually the entire tax base of whatever town has organized its local economy around that plant's continued operation. Industry analysts have specifically warned that if this sector cannot find a way to remain competitive, the damage would not stay contained within auto manufacturing itself. It would ripple outward into the broader Canadian economy with enough force to meaningfully affect national economic growth, potentially even tipping the country toward recession if the decline continues unchecked at its current pace. Industry analysts have started laying out exactly what happens if this trend continues unaddressed, and the picture is genuinely stark. One recent industry report from a major Canadian bank's research division identified tariffs, the broader shift toward electric vehicles, and rising competition from Chinese manufacturers as three separate forces converging on this industry simultaneously, describing Canada's auto sector as sitting directly at the center of that storm. The same report laid out multiple possible paths forward, ranging from a genuinely optimistic scenario where free trade gets restored, and Ontario's manufacturing base successfully pivots toward the electrification wave, to a considerably darker scenario where the auto provisions inside the broader North American trade agreement get weakened or scrapped entirely, opening the floodgates to a wave of cheaper Chinese electric vehicles that Canadian manufacturers would struggle to compete against on price alone. There is a genuinely strange irony sitting underneath this entire dispute too, one that rarely gets mentioned in the surface-level coverage. Right before these tariffs were imposed, the trade balance in the auto sector actually favored the United States by the largest margin it had ever reached in the history of this trading relationship. In other words, this tariff was not imposed to fix some new imbalance that had suddenly emerged. It landed at a moment when the numbers, if anything, already favored the country imposing the tariff. That detail complicates the simple narrative of American industry being unfairly undercut by Canadian competition, suggesting the tariff's real purpose may have had more to do with broader strategic pressure across the entire trade relationship than with correcting any specific auto sector grievance. It is worth sitting with that irony for a moment. An industry getting dismantled by a policy justified as correcting an imbalance that, by the government's own trade data, did not actually exist in the direction the tariff assumed. Now, let's talk about what Canada is actually doing to try to stop this bleeding, because the response has been substantial, even if the results remain genuinely uncertain. In February of this year, Carney announced a dedicated economic program specifically targeting the auto sector, built around accelerating Canada's own electric vehicle production rather than simply trying to preserve the traditional gasoline-powered manufacturing base that has been shrinking. The program includes corporate tax deductions and credits designed to incentivize EV production inside Canada, alongside a $5,000 consumer credit meant to boost domestic EV sales, all working toward an ambitious goal of 850,000 electric vehicles sold inside Canada. The strategic logic here is straightforward. If the traditional gasoline-powered manufacturing relationship with the United States keeps eroding under tariff pressure, Canada wants its auto industry to have already pivoted toward the part of the global auto market that is actually growing, rather than continuing to fight for a shrinking, tariff-burdened piece of the traditional market. This pivot is not happening in isolation from the rest of this trade war either, and it connects directly to a story we have already covered on this channel. Canada's approach to Chinese electric vehicles specifically, capping imports at a manageable level rather than either fully opening the market or maintaining the harsher tariffs from the previous government, reflects the same balancing act we saw play out with canola, trying to protect a domestic industry from being overwhelmed by cheaper foreign competition while still maintaining enough of a working relationship with China to avoid another retaliatory dispute damaging an entirely different sector of the economy. The auto industry sits at the intersection of nearly every major thread running through this trade war simultaneously: American tariffs, Chinese competition, and Canada's own attempt to chart an independent path through both pressures at once. Canada has also built in a specific mechanism to reward companies that keep production inside the country despite the pressure to do otherwise. Automakers operating in Canada can import a certain number of American-assembled, trade agreement-compliant vehicles free of Canada's own retaliatory tariffs, but only if they continue producing vehicles domestically and follow through on previously planned investments. This creates a direct incentive structure, essentially telling companies that maintaining Canadian production earns them tariff relief on the American vehicles they still need to bring in, rather than simply punishing every American import equally, regardless of what a company is doing on the Canadian side of its own operations. The timing of all this matters enormously too, because both countries are heading into a formal review of the broader North American trade agreement this year, with auto industry representatives on both sides of the border actively lobbying for tariff-free shipments to be restored as part of that renegotiation. Industry leaders have been blunt about what is at stake, describing the entire future of Canadian auto manufacturing as genuinely dependent on the outcome of these upcoming negotiations, not simply one factor among many, but potentially the deciding one. Trade lawyers and industry lobbyists on both sides of the border have been preparing for this review for months, aware that whatever framework emerges from these talks will likely shape the auto sector's trajectory for years, if not decades, beyond the immediate resolution of the current dispute. Let's talk about where this actually goes from here, because there are three realistic paths, and each one determines whether Canada's auto industry stabilizes or continues shrinking. The first scenario: the upcoming trade agreement review successfully restores tariff-free auto trade between the two countries, recognizing that an industry this deeply integrated across the border cannot function properly under sustained tariff pressure without real damage accumulating on both sides. Given that American consumers are also buying fewer vehicles and American dealers are also losing sales under the current arrangement, there is genuine mutual incentive to find a resolution, not just a one-sided Canadian request for relief. If this scenario plays out, expect production numbers to begin recovering gradually over the following few years. though likely never fully returning to the 2016 peak, given how much manufacturing capacity and expertise has already relocated or been lost during this period of disruption. Even a partial recovery would represent welcome relief for the hundreds of thousands of families whose livelihoods depend on this industry stabilizing rather than continuing its current trajectory. The second scenario: the trade review fails to resolve the auto tariff dispute, and Canada's manufacturing base continues its gradual erosion, with production settling at a new, permanently lower baseline as companies increasingly shift investment and capacity toward American plants where they can avoid the tariff entirely. This scenario does not require a single dramatic announcement. It simply requires the current trajectory continuing unaddressed, plant by plant, investment decision by investment decision, until Canada's auto sector looks structurally smaller on a permanent basis rather than temporarily depressed. Watch specifically for announcements involving new plant investments landing on the American side of the border rather than the Canadian side, since that pattern, repeated enough times, becomes very difficult to reverse even years later once alternative supply chains and workforces have been established elsewhere. The third scenario, and the one Carney's government is clearly betting significant resources on, Canada's pivot toward electric vehicle production succeeds well enough that the industry's future becomes less dependent on the traditional gasoline-powered trade relationship with the United States altogether, finding new competitive footing in a part of the global auto market where geography and existing tariff structures matter less than manufacturing quality and technological capability. This scenario would represent the most fundamental transformation of the three, essentially trading one kind of dependence for a genuinely different competitive position, though it also carries the most execution risk, given how aggressively countries around the world, including China, are simultaneously racing to dominate electric vehicle manufacturing, meaning Canada would be competing not just against American tariffs, but against a crowded global field, all chasing the same technological transition at the same time. Whichever path unfolds, this story connects directly to the pattern we have now documented across steel, aluminum, oil, and natural gas throughout this entire trade war. An industry gets squeezed by tariff pressure, Canada responds with a combination of retaliation and strategic investment aimed at reducing long-term dependence on the American relationship specifically, and the eventual outcome depends heavily on whether that investment pays off faster than the damage accumulates. Auto manufacturing is simply the largest, highest stakes version of that same pattern we have watched play out repeatedly, and in some ways it is the ultimate test of whether Canada's broader strategy throughout this trade war can actually work at the scale this industry demands. Here is my honest read on where this settles. I think some version of tariff relief emerges from this year's trade agreement review, since the mutual damage on both sides of the border creates real pressure toward resolution that some of the more one-sided disputes in this trade war have lacked. But I also do not think Canada's auto industry fully recovers to its previous scale, even with that relief, since companies do not easily reverse manufacturing investments once they have already shifted capacity elsewhere, meaning some of this damage looks permanent, regardless of how the political dispute eventually resolves. There is a sobering lesson in that permanence worth sitting with directly. Tariffs can be negotiated away in a single trade agreement, but a manufacturing plant that has already closed, a supply chain that has already reorganized around a different set of factories, a skilled workforce that has already scattered into other industries or other regions entirely, none of that snaps back into place just because the underlying policy dispute eventually gets resolved. The auto industry may end up serving as the clearest illustration in this entire trade war of just how much lasting damage even a temporary tariff can inflict on an industry built around decades of accumulated infrastructure and expertise. The bigger point I want you to sit with is this. An industry that took decades to build, employing more than 500,000 people, either directly or indirectly, has lost nearly half its production capacity in less time than it takes to build a single new manufacturing plant from scratch. That is the real cost of this trade war showing up in a single number, not an abstract policy dispute, but hundreds of thousands of livelihoods sitting downstream of decisions made in trade negotiations most of the affected families never had any say in. So here is the question I want you to sit with. If an industry this large, supporting this many Canadian families, can lose nearly half its production in under a decade because of a single tariff decision, does that change how you think about how fragile these deeply integrated cross-border industries actually are? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me whether you think Canada's electric vehicle pivot is the right strategy, or whether the country should be fighting harder to simply restore the traditional relationship instead. If breaking down exactly how these massive 500,000 job industries get reshaped by trade policy decisions is useful to you, hit subscribe. Because auto manufacturing is far from the last major Canadian industry facing exactly this kind of existential pressure. And if you have not seen our breakdown of the similar fight happening in Canada's steel industry, go watch that next. Because the same underlying pattern of tariff pressure and strategic response runs through both stories. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.